Season 2 Reloaded has just dropped and I've got you guys sorted with an updated best settings guide for Warzone 2 to achieve the highest FPS possible as well as maximizing your visibility. You want to make sure your display mode is set to full screen exclusive. I know, some of you guys like full screen borderless, you like to be able to alt tab out, but full screen exclusive will give you the lowest input latency possible and likely can give you a bit of an FPS boost as well. Display monitor and adapter, just make sure there's nothing weird being shown in either of the boxes here. You should have your monitor and GPU selected as you'd expect. And then screen refresh rate, just make sure you set this to whatever the refresh rate of your monitor is. You might not see the exact number here. For example, I've got a 240 Hertz monitor, so I pick the 239.97 option. Just select the nearest number. Dynamic resolution, while it can be a decent way of gaining some FPS, there are much better ways we're going to cover later in the video, so we want to keep this off. Aspect ratio, you should be able to leave it automatic. For me, that automatically puts it to 16:9, which is the aspect ratio of my monitor. If you're noticing any sort of weird stretched or squeezed resolution while you're playing, then it might be detecting things a bit weirdly and you might have to come in here and select potentially 16:9 or whatever your monitor aspect ratio is manually. VSync for gameplay and menus adds a load of input latency, especially with your mouse input. It makes the game feel pretty horrible to play. Yes, it does resolve screen tearing, but it's definitely not worth it. For your custom frame rate limit, a lot of people will put this to unlimited because they just want the most FPS possible, but actually what you should be doing is setting this to custom, clicking show more, and then setting individual frame rate limits for the different instances your game can be in. So when you're in gameplay, when you're actually in game running around, I'd recommend that you put this frame rate limit to your monitor's refresh rate. This will give you overall the smoothest gameplay. Any FPS you're getting beyond your monitor's refresh rate, unless you're down at like 60 Hertz, in which case you probably want to have it higher than 60, but having it set to the same as your screen's refresh rate gives you a nice smooth gameplay experience. Then for the menu custom frame rate limit, I like to leave it around the 100 mark or so. It means that my menu still feels nice and smooth. It doesn't feel like I've got a 60 Hertz mouse moving around while I'm doing my weapon loadouts and selecting my game modes, but it's not using anywhere near as much system resource as when I'm actually in the game. And then for the out of focus custom frame rate limit, you can lower this down really low. I've got it down to 30. It just means that when I alt tab out the game and I'm doing something on my side monitor, my whole PC isn't lagging and stuttering under the weight of trying to run Warzone 2. If you ever start having weird graphical bugs or stuttering or just issues that weren't present literally the day before, come in here and run this restart shaders optimization option. What it does is it deletes the shader cache and it does the re-optimization of your shaders, and it can fix a lot of those weird problems. Then we've got display gamma, which you want to set to 2.2 if you're on a monitor or 2.4 if you're on a TV. For your brightness, a lot of people leave this at default, but I'd actually recommend that you turn this up to 55. That extra 5 brightness really brightens up a lot of dark areas in game and makes it a little bit easier to see enemies in some of those indoor areas. And lastly, in the display area, you've got high dynamic range or HDR. I don't have a HDR monitor, but even if you did, you want to make sure you've got this off. This is not helpful for multiplayer gaming. It doesn't help visibility. It actually makes a lot of areas way more dark. Quite nice for single player games, but not good for Warzone 2. Next, onto the quality settings. So quality presets, this can just be left at custom or really whatever, because when we go down and change these settings, it's going to change around anyway. Render resolution, just leave this at 100. This is going to mean that you're rendering out your game at 100% of the resolution we selected earlier. If at the end of all this, you really need some more FPS, you're just starving for it, you can potentially bring this down to something like 90%, and it will give you a nice FPS boost at the cost of some blurriness to your game. The upscaling / sharpening setting is a really interesting one because there's actually 3 different useful options you can select in here. If you want to sharpen up your image and get the best visibility possible with in-game settings, come in here and select Fidelity FX Cache, click show more, and put your Fidelity FX Cache strength to around 75. I find that to be not too overpowering and just give a nice amount of sharpness to the game. This will lower your FPS by around 3 to 5 FPS depending on your build. However, if you're on an NVIDIA GPU and you want to get some nice sharpness without losing any FPS, what you can do is set this to off inside of the game, which will save you the FPS, and then we can sharpen up Warzone 2 outside of the game using a secret setting in the NVIDIA control panel, which I will show you a bit later if that sounds interesting. The last option, which I would recommend if you want to gain some FPS on a middle or low end build, would actually be AMD FSR 1.0 with the AMD FSR preset set at quality. Doesn't matter if you're running an NVIDIA GPU or an AMD GPU, this is available for both and will run just as good on either brand of GPU. What this does is it will actually lower your resolution down, which will gain you some very nice FPS. I've showed this in a previous video. And then it uses super resolution to bring you back up to a much clearer image, very similar to your native resolution. This is really good for gaining some FPS when you need it. For your anti-aliasing, we've only got two options. You can't turn it off, unfortunately, so we can either pick SMA AT2X or Filmic SMA AT2X. The normal option will give you slightly better FPS. It can be a considerable boost on those lower or mid-end systems, so that's what I'd recommend for you guys. However, try out Filmic SMAA, see how much you lose, and see if it's worth it, because it gets rid of the bug where you have the kind of dots appearing on all the textures in the game. You might not know what I'm talking about. If you don't, then just run the SMAA option. But if you've noticed it, the Filmic option sorts that. For the anti-aliasing quality, put this down to normal. I found that putting this down to low makes the anti-aliasing look really terrible, whereas the normal setting has pretty much the same FPS as the low setting, but looks considerably better. Video memory scale remains the most misunderstood option in all of the Warzone 2 settings. People are still setting this to 90 and thinking that that's going to give the highest amount of VRAM for Warzone 2 to run and give you the highest FPS, when in actual fact, it just causes a ton of stutters. It even says over here, when you experience hitches, that you should lower this settings target. For me, and for loads of you guys running even just middle to those high-end GPUs, turn this all the way down to 50. You won't notice much difference in FPS, but the 1% lows, which is basically the stuttering, they pretty much disappear when you've got this setting correct. Start off using 50, see how that plays for a few games, and then if you need to, you can slowly rise it up until you find that sweet spot with the smallest amount of stutters possible. If you're finding my content today to be informative or useful, then the best way you can support me is to head down below and click the subscribe button. It only takes 1 second of your time to go and do, and I am aiming for 100,000 this year, so why not come along for the ride? For texture resolution, it's very similar to anti-aliasing quality as before. I like to put this on the low setting. It looks a hell of a lot better than very low, with very similar FPS and much less of an FPS drop than you get from running normal or high. Texture filter anisotropic, you can leave this on high. It has little to no effect on performance and just overall improves the clarity of most of your textures when you're looking at them from an angle. Nearby and distant level of detail, you can put these both on low. They have pretty much no effect on your visuals of your game. It's not like something's gonna pop in or out at certain distances. You really don't notice that, and it does give a nice little bit of performance boost. For the clutter draw distance, we're going to be changing this inside of a config file later on to a setting that gives a very nice FPS boost that is outside of the range you can do inside of the game, so it doesn't matter what we set it to right now. Particle quality and particle quality level, you can put these both on their lowest settings, so that will be low and very low. It affects how the visuals of fire and thermites and explosions look. To be honest, you're probably not going to be sitting around staring at these things that often in game to really realize the degraded quality, but it does give a very nice performance boost, so make sure you got them in the lower settings. Bullet impacts are completely personal preference. They have no effect on performance. I personally like to leave them on. Persistent damage layers doesn't seem to have much effect on performance whatsoever. I tend to turn this off. It's basically visual clutter in game. When an explosion goes off, it leaves like a mark on a wall or on the floor. I don't like it, so I'd recommend that you turn it off. Shader quality is a big FPS killer. You need to put this all the way down to low. I know a lot of people didn't like doing this when the game first came out because it would make all of your camos look terrible, like the gold camo looked like cheese, but it doesn't do that anymore. They've resolved that issue, and low shader quality looks absolutely fine now with that nice FPS boost. Tessellation is just an unnecessary addition to the game. It doesn't seem to have much effect on FPS, so it's basically personal preference. I personally say you should have it off. Terrain memory is actually a bit of a weird one. A lot of people come in here and set this to minimum alongside all the other low settings, but having this set to max seems to have no effect on FPS, but actually seems to help out how textures look in game. It's essentially like a free texture clarity boost with no effect on FPS, so you actually want to set this to max. On-demand texture streaming, definitely a bad idea. Turn this off, and then we have to click yes to say we want to disable it. This is going to try and download these really high quality textures into your game while you're playing. that is not something we want to be doing. Streaming quality has such a minimum effect on your visuals in game. It's sort of like your draw distance, where things that are really far away might not look as good when we turn streaming quality down, but it's so minimal that I would just recommend you run it on low anyway. Volumetric quality is another big FPS killer. It's all to do with how light rays look, how fog looks in game. You need to make sure you've got this on low to get a really big performance boost. Deferred physics quality and water caustics are all to do with the water visuals inside of Warzone 2. There's a ton of water in this game. You've got rivers, you've got the sea areas as well, and anytime you look at those areas with these settings turned high, you lose a lot of FPS. So I'd recommend you turn the deferred physics quality off and also the water caustics off. Shadow map resolution is very similar to textures and the anti-aliasing quality from earlier. The lowest setting looks really bad. Just going up one to the low setting looks a ton better, with basically no FPS hit going from the lowest setting, so that's what I'd recommend. The screen space shadows and spot shadow quality are shadows that we don't really care about, so we need to turn these off and to low. Spot cache, even though the effect on VRAM says that it's high, you actually want to leave this at ultra. It helps out with a load of stuttering issues. If you have any problems running at ultra, you can try high. Some people get better results at high than at ultra, but try one of these two out and see which gives you the less stuttering. Particle lighting is similar to the other particle options we had earlier. We don't care about this kind of stuff, so we want to put this on low. And then ambient occlusion, you can see here that when you've got ambient occlusion on, the areas in corners become a lot darker, a lot more misty. It actually gives more opportunity for enemies to hide in corners, you not see them, and then you end up dying to them. So ambient occlusion, make sure that this is off. For screen space reflections and static reflection quality, very simple. We're putting them off and to low. We don't care about reflection quality in game. I don't really ever see this being a helpful setting, even to potentially see an enemy in a window or something. It just doesn't happen, so turn them off. And weather grid volumes, turn those off as well. NVIDIA Reflex low latency, should you have this at on or on plus boost? Well, it's all going to depend on what your CPU and GPU configuration is. If you have a slightly older CPU, but a decently powerful GPU, so probably your CPU is the bottleneck of your system, which a lot of people who build gaming PCs end up having because they don't think they need strong CPUs. Well, in that scenario, put this on plus boost. It says over here that this is used for CPU bound cases, so yeah, on plus boost for that. If your GPU and CPU are on par with each other, which is like in my build, you'll actually get better performance out of running the on option. If you don't know which of these situations you're in, however, just try running on and then try running on plus boost, try running some benchmarks and just see which feels better. Don't assume that on plus boost will be the best option. And to finish off the quality settings, all of these post-processing effects we want to turn off. The only one which can be helpful is for those of you who are having this stuttering when the plane flies in at the beginning of the game and then when you parachute you're stuttering as well. In that scenario, weapon motion blur has been known to actually resolve all of that stuttering, but then you're stuck with weapon motion blur on inside of the game, which I don't like the look of, so you can try it out if you want to try and fix that issue. I'd recommend you keep it off. And now for your view settings. For field of view, I've always recommended that you put this to 120, just get the maximum FOV. The more FOV you have, the more info you have inside of the game, and therefore the better decisions you can make. However, I know a lot of people actually get a lot better gameplay out of running something like 110, because the smaller FOV makes enemies that you're shooting at appear a little bit bigger, and therefore it can be easier to track them while you're shooting. I personally still like 120, but I just wanted to point that out because some of you might like 110. ADS field of view, you want to make sure this is at affected. This means that that larger FOV that we've selected up here will actually affect our ADS. So when we ADS in, we don't have as much visual recoil of the gun bouncing around because we haven't zoomed in so much on our gun. This is a really important setting. Weapon field of view is pretty much personal preference. Some people like running wide, including myself, because it just brings the gun a little bit further away from us, and I find that it once again lowers the visual recoil just that little bit more. But I know some people like running default. Never really see anyone run narrow, so just try these out and see which one you like. Third person field of view, well, there's no third person person mode in the game at the moment, so I guess it doesn't really matter, but I'd recommend that you max this out in the same way that I recommend you max normal FOV out. And then vehicle FOV, once again, I'd recommend you put this to wide so that when you're driving around in vehicles, you can get the most information possible. First person camera movement, I always put this to least so that any screen shakes are kept to a minimum. I would do the same for third person as well. Third person ADS transition doesn't matter because we're not playing third person at the moment anyway. And default spectator camera, I'd actually recommend you turn this to game perspective so that when you're spectating a teammate, you're actually in first person looking at them as if it's you playing. If you want to make your game a little bit more colorful, then you can come over to the interface area, go to color customization, and just copy these color filter settings. So filter 2, both 100, 100. It just makes your game look overall a little bit more vibrant, and we'll do some more color vibrant stuff in the NVIDIA settings later on in the video. Save all those settings, close down your game because we're going to be heading into the game config files to get an even bigger FPS boost. So the file directory for the config file we're going to be editing is documents, then Call of Duty, then players, and then we're going to be opening up the options.3.cod22 file. You're going to right click here, go to edit, and it should open up the file inside of a notepad editor. The first setting you want to find in here is async compute. By default, it's set to true. We want to change this to false. What this has to do with is how your GPU and your CPU interact with each other to run the game. That's sort of like a very high level explanation, but by running this at false, you get a nice FPS boost. This has been tested on a ton of different systems outside of mine, and everyone says that false is the best option. The next setting is going to be the clutter max dist, and this is all going to be in relation to that setting that I mentioned earlier, the clutter draw distance inside of the game. As I said, inside of this config file, we can set it to a setting which you can't reach in game. What you do is you're going to copy the 100.0000, all the zeros here, copy that, put it in between the inverted commas, the speech marks, and then paste it. That's going to set it lower than you can reach in game and give you, once again, a nice FPS boost. And the final setting you're going to be changing in here is the renderer worker count, which is right near the bottom. And this is all to do with how many threads or how many cores of your CPU are going to be used when playing the game. The optimal value for this setting is going to be equal to the number of cores that your CPU has, the number of physical cores. To get this number correct, I'd recommend that you go to the web page for your CPU. So for example, here I've looked up an Intel CPU, an i7-8700K. You can see here that total cores is 6. So if I had an 8700K, I would put 6 in the file. I'll show you an example for AMD here. This is a 3700X, a Ryzen 7. You can see in here, number of CPU cores, not number of threads, number of CPU cores is 8. So for a 3700X, the best option would be 8. Now, if you have one of the latest Intel CPUs, which is like what I've got, and you search it up, you'll notice that you have number of performance cores and number of efficient cores. This is a new thing that newer Intel CPUs have. In this situation, you want to set it to the number of performance cores, not the total number. So that is why I, with my 12700K, have got this set to 8 inside of the config file. Save the changes to that config file, and then the next thing you want to do is come down to your search bar and search for graphics. Go to the graphics settings, and you'll have an option in here called hardware accelerated GPU scheduling. By default, this might be on because it can help with performance in some other games. For a lot of games, it doesn't seem to matter whether you've got it on or off, but for Warzone 2, you need to make sure this is set to off. This is another setting which a lot of people don't have set correctly, and it can affect performance massively in this game. Make sure you've got this off. The last settings we're going to cover today are all for NVIDIA GPU users. So for you guys, right click on your desktop, go to NVIDIA Control Panel, then manage 3D settings and scroll down in the global settings to shader cache size. You want to set this all the way up to the max size of unlimited. Don't worry, it's not going to take up loads of space on your hard drive. You don't need to worry about that. What this does do is it works in a similar way to Spot Cache inside of Warzone 2, and it helps out with stuttering just that little bit more. By having all of these settings like I've told you today, I now have no stuttering whatsoever inside of the game. To boost your colors even more, I would then go to Adjust Desktop Color Settings and turn the digital vibrance on your primary monitor up to around 65 to 70%. I find that this gives enough of of a color boost where my game doesn't look horrendously flat and gray tone, but it doesn't completely blow out the colors and make the rest of my kind of PC experience horrific. This is a really, really nice setting to have in general for any game, not just Warzone 2. And the final thing to cover today is that secret sharpening setting that I mentioned earlier, specifically for NVIDIA users. If you come back to the Manage 3D Settings area and go to Program Settings, and you can see here I've got Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2.22 selected here, I have this image scaling option. Now, this is not the setting we want. We want to get access to the old image sharpening option, which we can luckily do with a slight bit of registry tweaking. So close down your NVIDIA control panel and search for Regedit or Registry Editor. From in here, you then want to input this path. It's computer, H-key local machine, system, CurrentControlSet, services, nvlddmkm, FTS. I'll have that whole path in the description below. If I search for this, I get this big list of these enable GR values. The one we want to look for is enable GR535. Just double click that and change the value data from 1 to 0. Click OK, close out of the registry editor, and now reopen the NVIDIA control panel. And what we should see is that the image scaling has been replaced with image sharpening, which is a very, very efficient, basically 0 FPS loss sharpening method, which we can apply to Warzone 2. So click Program Settings. Once again, make sure you've got Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 selected. If you need to, you'll need to add it from the Add button here. And then turn your image sharpening on. And I personally like the default settings. I think 0.65 sharpen with a 0.17 ignore film grain looks really, really good in game. So we just want to click OK, click Apply, and we are not done yet. With that sharpening applied, you do get some graphical glitches in-game because it's all being done at a shader level. So we need to completely clear out our shader cache from outside of the game and get the shaders to reinstall when we start up the game. To do that, find your Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 on Steam or on Battle.net and head to the local files. So browse local files on here. And then from within here, you want to go to shader cache. Just click Control A, and then I do a Shift Delete, which is a permanent delete of everything in here. Wait just a second. It will close it all down and get rid of it all. Then when you reopen the game, you should notice that we get that shader optimization pop up in the top left-hand corner, meaning that our shaders are reinstalling. So wait just a second. There it is at the top, shader optimization, 0%. It should install pretty quickly. And once it's got to 100%, you will have the new sharpening enabled inside of the game. And yeah, it makes the game look incredibly better. For a full breakdown of the best NVIDIA control panel settings for Warzone 2, I've already got a video on that over here, which you need to go and watch next if you haven't already. It gives the full breakdown you need, gives a nice little extra FPS boost, as well as really tightening in that visual fidelity.